Okay, we're going to be using the scene from the last chapter to animate some of our clouds, and I can kind of show you how that's going to look with some of the different features. First thing I want to do is actually edit our procedural terrain, and I'm just going to remove that ecosystem we added on there, just to speed up rendering a little bit. And we don't need to have those objects in there to demonstrate this. But one thing we want to take a look at is our low clouds that we have on the bottom of our terrain, and the ones that are actually going through it. And I'm just going to animate those really quick. And it's fairly easy what we can do. First I'm going to go to Display Timeline and click Show Timeline. And I'm just going to close out our animation setup wizard. And now I want to decide how long our animation is going to be. And I think I can just drag this to around 60 frames. So we have, if we're working in 30 frames per second, that would be a 2-second animation. And we want to go back up to our atmosphere editor. And now that we have our timeline set to a later part in the scene, I'm going to select our low clouds. And what I can do is actually change any number of these settings, and they'll become animated. So let's say we wanted to have a very low density or a lower density in the beginning of the scene, and then have those clouds start thickening up on the bottom. So all we'd really have to do is create our density and drag that up a little bit higher, up to 90%, and it's going to ask us if we'd like to animate, and I'm going to click yes. What I can also do is increase our cover, so we have a nice blend into that as well. And as you can see, we have a lot more clouds in the scene in that area. And keep in mind, we also have our decay near foreign objects on for these clouds, so then we're not going to really see them in this front part, in this front area. And we could also increase our altitude if we wanted, maybe raise up our height just a tiny little bit. And we can see that start to cover a little bit more. And now, considering this is only a 2-second animation, this changes are going to go by fairly quickly. So I'm going to turn that down just a tiny little bit. And we're just going to be rendering an animation preview to take a look and see what's happening in our scene. You can see I got rid of those clouds that started to show up in here. If we had a little bit of a longer animation, then maybe I could change the height up. But since we're working with only about 2 seconds, we'll be able to see the changes well enough in this area. What I also want to do is increase our rate of change on these clouds, and that way we can have them moving a little bit. And I don't want to go too high, so I'm going to go around 0.5. And I also want to increase our velocity to about 0.5. Because if we have it too high, then the changes are going to be reflected so quickly that we're not really going to get to see them. We could do the same thing with our other clouds as well. Those also can be animated just as these are. You just want to make sure you're in the right part of the timeline when you're animating. I'm also going to go back to our first frame, and we can see that our changes have gone away, and we've gone back to our original settings. And I'm just going to decrease our cover a little bit so we can see those clouds really come in throughout the timeline and throughout the 2 seconds of animation that we have. And I'm just going to click OK right now, because we're just going to be focusing on these bottom clouds right now. And if we wanted to, we could also animate the top clouds in just the same way. But let's go ahead, go to Animation, and Render Animation Preview. And what this is going to do is just give us a very small preview on the bottom. What we have is in a 114 by 64 pixel resolution for our render, so it's very small. It'll render very quickly. It's also only rendering in our preview render and not any other the better settings. So it's just a nice little quick preview, but it'll give us an idea of how our cloud animation is going to look. And then if we wish to create larger render and animate that larger, we can do that through our actual animation options and render options. And now that our preview is done, we can see all of our frames on the bottom just underneath our timeline. And if I just scrub through, we can see the changes that our clouds are making throughout that scene and throughout those couple of seconds. We also have it doubled up right now, so it's showing a little bit later in the animation on the bottom. But just scrubbing through, we can see how our changes that we made in the atmosphere editor are really making a very neat scene where we just have this mist sort of rolling on the bottom. And like I said, we could do the same thing with our top clouds. And render times for this are really going to vary depending on how many clouds you have in the scene and what types of clouds. In this case, the preview didn't take very long to render, but of course the actual scene could take some time. But since in this case we're only animating one set of clouds, what we can actually do is just render our scene separately, just the background clouds, and keep our mountains and other layers of clouds separate, and we can actually render an HDRI image. And then what we can do is just light our entire scene with that image. And I'm just going to show you that really quick, and all we really have to do is first create a new layer, and I'm going to drag our procedural terrain into that layer so that we can just turn it off. And we can see that our terrain will not show up anymore in our scene. We're hiding it from mostly our scene, but not our render, so we're going to go ahead and hide from render. And now we don't have to worry about that at all. We can go up to our atmosphere editor, and we can turn off those low clouds, and click OK. So now we just see our outside sky, and if the sky isn't going to be changing, then there's no sense in re-rendering it every single time we need a frame. So what we can actually do is either just render this frame out and then composite that together, and we could just stick this in the background, or we can render our entire HDRI image. Now the problem with that is really depending on your CPU speed. Rendering HDRI image can take a very long time because you need very high resolutions. So if we take a look at our render options, we'll actually need to go beyond the 1600 by 900, and we'd want to type in maybe 2400, and we can see that we have 2400 by 4267, which should be a good enough size depending on how high your resolution is going to be. If you're rendering television 16 by 9 HD, then you're going to need a lot higher of a resolution, and sometimes it's not even worth rendering that HDRI. So it really depends on the length of your animation. But if we want to create an HDRI, we can set up our panoramic view and our spherical render, making sure that our H angle is at 360 and our V angle is at 180. And what this will do is render the entire scene. And if we can get a preview here, on the side we'll be able to see that it's rendering the entire sky and not just a small portion of it. So we can see it right now that we have all of our clouds behind us, and this is the main area that we were seeing before. It's just where this little tiny bit where the sun is. So you want to make sure that this little area, when you do your overall HDRI render, is at least equal to your actual render that you had before. And now we're going to take a look at adjusting the renders for your clouds to reduce graininess. And I'm just going to create a new scene and just use the default. And now we have a new scene, and I'm just going to add a simple cloud layer. And I could just do that by adding cloud layer, and then it'll ask us which clouds we'd like to add. And I'm just going to select something at random. And I'm going to point our camera towards the sky. And now we want to take a look at a render for our clouds. Just a basic render at the settings we're at right now. I'm going to set this to a final, render to screen, in 640 by 480. And a final render should be good actually throughout this area right now, because we're not editing anything other than the sky. And for the most part, a lot of this has to do with some of your other effects, like radiosity, global illumination. And so if we're trying to blend a scene together that we have with terrains and ecosystems along with our sky, then of course we're going to want to increase these values to match what we're going to be doing in the atmosphere editor. But I'm just going to go ahead and render this out right now. And we can take a look at the current quality, and then we can start making some adjustments to make it look a lot better. We can see in the finished frame that we have a lot of grain in these different areas. And one thing we can do is increase that final amount to broadcast or something a little bit higher. And that will increase the quality and reduce the grain of our clouds. But there's also another tool that we can use that works a little bit better, and it's just a simple adjustment. And then we don't have to worry about compromising anything else in our scene. We can separate the quality of our clouds entirely from our scene, but sometimes we don't need to drag that value up as high as we need to when we are using final renders. So it really depends on what else you have in the scene and if everything else looks good at that render point. Because sometimes you can just use a final render and it'll look fine. So I'm just going to go ahead and close this out, and we can go back up to the atmosphere editor. And now we're going to take a look at our sky, fog, and haze tab and go to the global setting quality boost. Now quality boost is going to entirely control our whole scene. So not just our clouds, but the sky and the entirety of the quality of the scene. And I'm just going to drag this up to 4 for right now, and that's going to completely remove the grain from our scene. So I'll click OK, and we'll go ahead and render that out. And now we can see that all of our grain is gone from our clouds completely. It did take about 6 times longer to render this frame, but it does look really good. The only problem is it looks a little bit too clean. Sometimes grain can be a good thing, because if you look at film and you look at photographs, you always know grain in your scene. And if you actually go outside and snap a picture of the sky and take a look at it, you will notice that there is a lot of grain. And that's just part of photography and part of film. Although we're getting into the digital revolution now, and a lot of that's being reduced, we can get more of a classic film look with grain. And when we're matching to actual film, in that case, then you want a little bit of grain. And then you have to decide whether or not you want to render out completely within view to get rid of your grain and then add it later in post-processing, or you could just turn down that value a little and add a little tiny bit of grain. So it really depends on which medium you're using the scene for. Another thing to keep in mind is right now we're using a very small resolution, and this is pretty much classic television resolution, 640 by 480, or older screen resolutions for computers. So we might get a different effect and a different look for our clouds with a higher render. If we're rendering this in an HD resolution, we might actually start noticing grain. And in that case, what you can do is actually turn up the value just a little bit higher. So we can go to our atmosphere editor, the sky, fog, and haze tab, and we can go beyond a quality boost of 4. If we wanted to, we can bring this number as high as we want, and the higher we bring it, the better quality our entire sky is going to look, and it's going to reduce grain. So this is definitely the number to take a look at if you're going to be rendering very high resolution frames in film, HD, especially when you're working with 1080p or 1080i. You want to keep this in mind, and if you have to, you can always just boost that up. I can turn that to an 8, and that will increase the quality of our render. But with every number you raise this up, it's going to increase your render times by quite a bit, so that's also something to keep in mind.